Hello and welcome to another Brawl video. This week my supporters on Patreon voted for Ashling the Limitless as our commander, so a 5-color evoke elementals deck. As we take a look at Ashling, a 3-mana 2/3, saying elemental permanent spells we cast from our hand gain evoke for 4 mana as we cast them. So that's a way to cheaply get our enter the battlefield abilities to trigger on some of our more expensive elementals. And whenever we sacrifice a non-token elemental, which happens with evoke, we now get to create a token that's a copy of it. The token gains haste until end of turn, and we also have to sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step, unless we pay one of each color. So there is still potentially a way to keep that creature in play, but just getting to trigger any of its abilities twice and still get a nice attack in is often good enough. So if we take a look at our deck breakdown, I've split it up into a few different categories, starting with a bit of mana acceleration, ways to maybe get Ashling and some of our other expensive elementals in play ahead of schedule, and of course cost reduction effects are also incredibly effective, since they also reduce the cost of the evoke once we have Ashling in play, so we can maybe evoke some of our expensive elementals for just 2 or 3 mana and potentially chain together a whole bunch of them in one turn. And then next up, of course, the biggest category are the elementals themselves. This time I've sorted them according to our expected curve, since some of these elementals we can also evoke naturally for just 2 or 3 mana, so we can get them in play a little bit sooner. Even with Ashling in play, we can still evoke them with our own ability, which will often be cheaper than evoking for 4. And then we have some of the more expensive elementals that we're hoping to evoke for 4 mana with our commander in play, and then some 5-drops which are still realistic to hardcast, but of course are also great to evoke if we have Ashling in play instead. And then a small miscellaneous section which includes a little bit of removal, some additional card draw enchantments, which also pair well with evoking all these large creatures. So that's kind of our deck in a nutshell. Now for the deep dive, starting with our mana acceleration. The benefit of playing 5 colors is that we get to play all these 1-mana green accelerants, including Avis's Pilgrim, which you can only play in a green-white deck otherwise, Birds of Paradise, the Lighted Halfling, the classic Elvish Mystic, and the Llanowar Elves, but we also get to play with the 2 Hierarchs, so the Junt one and the Bant one. Then there's Ashling Rekindled, which can also give us a mana boost if we transform it into Ashling Rhymebound. Can also help improve our hand by discarding and drawing. Flamebraider can make 2 mana that we can spend on elemental spells. Then there's the Fanatic of Aronas, an honorary elemental here, since it can routinely make 4 green mana, which is perfect for evoking another elemental out. We've got Farseek, perfect to fix our colors in a 5-color deck. Leafkin Druids, an elemental that taps for a green or double green with 4 or more creatures in play. Arcane Signet can make a mana of any color. And then we've got Mutable Explorer, which is also excellent to either cast or evoke, as we can maybe get 2 Mutavaults now to make more mana. There's Nissa, which is excellent with our fetch lands, so we can also find additional elementals with the ability and make additional mana. And then we've got some of our cost reducers. Herald's Horn and Gathering Stone are quite similar, revealing the top card of our library at the beginning of our upkeep each turn. If it's an elemental, we can put it in hand. Gathering Stone can also decide to put them in the graveyard instead, and they both reduce our elementals by 1 mana. And then we also have Urza's Incubator, which can discount our elementals by 2. Now this is symmetrical, so it can also affect opposing elementals, but hopefully there's not too many of those floating around. And then Patchwork Banner can also make a mana of any color while pumping up all our elementals. Then we move on to our actual creatures, starting with our 2-drops, where Masked Vandal can help blow up artifacts or enchantments, and by evoking our creatures we naturally will have something in the graveyard we can exile. Voice of Resurgence is fine to play for 2 mana to punish opposing instants, especially good against counter spells, but can also be evoked later, and then we'll leave behind an elemental twice essentially, once when it gets evoked and then once again when it dies end of turn, so it can still leave some nice bodies behind. The Chomping Changeling, another way to deal with artifacts or enchantments. The Flamekin can help us find additional elementals when it enters, so that can also maybe trigger twice if we evoke it. Risen Reef, one of our better payoffs for running all these elemental spells, can also put a bunch of extra lands on the battlefield. Muldrifter, also excellent to evoke for 3 mana with Ashling in play, as we essentially draw 4 cards. There's a Vibrance, which can be evoked for 2 mana to either deal 3 damage or find a land, but can also of course cast it for 5 or evoke it for 4 to get both abilities now if we cast it for double red, double green. Same with Wistfulness to blow up once again artifacts and enchantments, or help draw a few more cards. And then Rottenmouth Viper we can even cast for free if we have Ashling in play and sacrifice 4 of our non-land permanents. And then when Rottenmouth Viper enters, we sacrifice it, but still make the opponent either discard a card, lose 4 life, or sacrifice a non-land permanent. And then when it returns, it triggers once again, and can also immediately attack, putting a second blight counter on it, so the damage can add up very quickly. And by sacrificing some of our elementals, especially the non-token elementals with the Viper, if we have Ashling in play, they will also come back once again. So that's another way to maybe re-trigger some enter the battlefield abilities, since Ashling doesn't care how we sacrificed our elementals, so doing it with the Viper still counts. And then Null Drifter, a bigger, improved version of Mull Drifter, of course, also great with Annihilator 1. And Thunderflock, another card we can potentially play for free, since it gets an X mana discount where X is the greatest mana value among elementals we control. So just with Ashling in play, we could evoke this for 1 mana. As soon as we have a 4 mana elemental in play, we can evoke this for free, and then we can bounce all non-elementals back to hand. So this can also be incredibly effective. Then we've got a Graveshifter to rebuy elementals from our graveyard, which is great when we evoke a bunch of our creatures, so they naturally end up in the graveyard, and this can also, of course, trigger twice. Grief to make the opponent discard a non-land card. We've got Champion of the Path, which can just straight up damage the opponent a whole bunch, equal to our elemental's power when they enter. Scampering Scorcher to leave behind a whole bunch of tokens, and can also give our elementals haste. Then Twin Flame Travelers can double the triggers from our elementals. We also have a Roaming Throne, which is very similar. This one, of course, not an elemental, so we cannot evoke it with Ashling, but still functions in a very similar fashion. And then we've got Omnath, Locus of the Royal, alongside a bunch of other Omnaths, so we can go over all of them here. Locus of Rage making a whole bunch of elemental tokens, and then by sacrificing our elementals to evoke, we also trigger Omnath to deal 3 damage on the way out. So this is also incredibly powerful, especially if we have some fetch lands left over. And then Omnath, Locus of Creation, even the nerfed version is still excellent, also to evoke, as we get to draw a card when it enters each time, so we get to draw 2. And then once again with a fetch land, we maybe get 4 mana back, so we can evoke another elemental afterwards. And then we also have the Shine Striker, hopefully with multiple colored permanents in play to draw a few cards. Lumra can put a bunch of lands into play, also excellent with any previously used fetch lands, which we get to return. Soul of Migration can leave behind a bunch of bird tokens. Titan of Industry, yet another way to deal with artifacts and enchantments, can gain life and leave behind a Rhino token. We've got Shroud Stomper, making the opponent lose 2 life, whereas we get to gain 2 and draw a card when it enters or attacks. It's another card that can trigger several times if we evoke it with Ashling. And then the Interdisciplinary Mascot has Convoke, so with Ashling in play, tapping 4 creatures essentially lets us cast this for free, and then we get to have a 5/5 enter, looking at the top 4 cards of our library, putting one of those cards into our hand, so this can also trigger twice and give us 2 great cards among the top 8. And then we've got some more interaction with Solitude, also great to just cast normally. Won't have too many ways to evoke this one for free, since we don't have a ton of white cards in our deck, but still excellent with Ashling. Cavalier of Gales lets us brainstorm when it enters, so that can also trigger twice. And then if the Cavalier dies on the first evoke, we also get to shuffle it back into our library and then scry 2, so that's a way to immediately get rid of some of the unwanted cards that we brainstormed back on top of the deck. Then Fury can also be brutal with Ashling around, as we can maybe evoke it for free by pitching a red card from hand, and then it will still come back, dealing a ton of damage. We've got Cavalier of Flame to discard and draw when it enters, can also give our creatures haste, and can also deal damage to an opponent equal to the number of lands in our graveyard when it dies, so that also gets to trigger a whole bunch. Got Titania to return lands from the graveyard, so can get back a fetch land. If we evoke it, we can trigger this twice, and then when we sacrifice those fetch lands, we'll get a 5/3 elemental each time, so that can also add up. Cavalier of Thorns to help us ramp when it enters, can also maybe get an important card back on top of the deck when it dies. And then Yarok, also an elemental that doubles all our triggers, so we've got 3 total in the deck. And then our miscellaneous section has Ephemerate as a cheap flicker effect. Before we sacrifice a creature to evoke, of course has to be a non-token creature, then we get to return it back to play, re-enabling its Enter the Battlefield ability, and now we no longer have to sacrifice it to evoke. And then with Rebound we get to do it all over again on the next turn. We've got Swords to Plowshares as our only instant speed removal spell in the deck for 1 mana. Up the Beanstalk can also repeatedly trigger in this deck, even if we evoke some of our more expensive elementals. There's Garruk's Uprising, giving our creatures trample and drawing whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters. And then we cover the Roaming Throne, and finally Ashling's Command. This one we cannot, of course, evoke, since they did errata Ashling to say permanent spell as opposed to just an elemental spell. But Ashling's Command is still great at copying our elementals, dealing 2 damage to opposing creatures, drawing some cards, or making treasure, any 2 of those 4 modes. And then the mana base has a ton of mana fixing. I did make sure to have enough untapped green sources to reliably cast our green 1-drops, so ideally we need around 19 of those to cast those reliably. And then of course a nice combination of shock lands, fetch lands. I'm running the set of triomes here as well as more mana fixing. And then we also have some elemental themed lands, Cavern of Souls being the best one to make our elementals uncounterable. And then we also have Eclipse Realms, Secluded Courtyard, Territory, and a few more 5-color lands with Confluence and a Command Tower. So yeah, that's our deck. Now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Okay, we're on the play with a promising hand. Got early acceleration, a Gathering Stone to hopefully find more elementals. Opponent with Baird, so can expect him to go wide. And then typically Ketra Triome is the priority. Good Signet and then Swords to Guide. Kind of like the Farseek here. And then probably want to get another Triome. Make it Zagoth Triome. Opponent with a Knight Counselor. Gets in for 1. Alright, Cavalier Flame does require triple red. So it's not the easiest to cast, but we can always look to evoke it instead. So this turn could go Signet plus Mutable Explorer, unless we want to also evoke this with Ashling. Could just play the Gathering Stone. Don't hate the idea of just getting a warm body on the battlefield. And then next turn I can maybe double spell Gathering Stone with Ashling. Counselor attacks. And lists. But I could still trade here. And there's Baird. With a 1-time boon, which immediately will let it generate a 1/1 token. A land tax is certainly going to trigger. Okay. Hierarch may be something I'm interested in discarding with a Cavalier. So this turn, a Gathering Stone into Ashling. Say no to the Halfling. Swords on Baird was somewhat tempting, but it's not the scariest creature out there. Alright, Flash is annoying. Takes out Ashling. Back to the command zone, still very castable at 4 mana. If I draw land, I could still play it and evoke, essentially for 3 mana thanks to Gathering Stone. But yeah, the Guide of Souls probably has to go. Rootbound Crag we can keep. So I could make the play I described of Ashling into Cavalier. Or I can go Ashling, Swords to Guide. Or even Cavalier, Swords to Guide. Yeah, maybe we'll start there. Find a different hierarch. Okay, so yeah, let's just swords now maybe. And then I can keep Mutavault as a blocker in case they answer Cavalier. Our opponent is not going to miss another lane drop this game. And yeah, ossification clears Cavalier. Can later maybe get it back if we find a way to destroy their enchantment. And Mutavault might get an ambush. Go to blockers. Alright, they had a pump spell. Fair enough. So we lose Mutavaults. Yeah, we need a good top deck. And we found one. Cavalier of Thorns and another Birds. So playing Ashling for 4 mana does not let me evoke the Cavalier, so I should probably just cast it. And then can still play both mana creatures out. Would have liked drawing the Chomping Changeling to get our Cavalier of Flame back. Do still have a couple ways to recur creatures out of the graveyard, with Grave Shifter, for instance. So that would be excellent, being able to evoke it and trigger it twice. Alright, Cavalier at least did stabilize us for now. But by discarding a bunch of lands, they also make it easier to escape Flage. Omnath was an excellent draw. And so is Risen Reef. Alright, we're back in business. So step 1 might be Risen Reef. Ashling's Command is also great. So, yeah, I don't think I need Ashling, just play Omnath, and then I still have the mana for Ashling's Command. Take out Baird. Trigger Omnath. And attack with Cavalier. And I could Ashling's Command right now just to clear all the 1/1s. What is Flage gonna take out? Maybe Omnath? Could put a +1 counter on it at instant speed. Let's wait on the Ashling's Command. If our opponent plays a board wipe, then I'm not sure yet what the plan is. But Cavalier dying can also put a card back on top. So we'll see. Yeah, opponent sending in all their 1/1s, so usually means a sweeper is incoming. Urza Silex, in fact. Yeah, that one's quite good. I get to choose 6 lands and destroy all other permanents, including my Gathering Stone. So, am I going to want to Ashling's Command in response to them activating it? Probably not. I would maybe trigger Risen Reef, but any lands I reveal, I guess I could still put in my hand. Cavalier would also put a land in play that I'm not going to get to keep. How many lands does Omnath need to draw a card? 8 or more. So we're actually also close to that point. Yeah, I think I just let this happen. And then choose 6 lanes. Do get back Cavalier of Flame, so that's pretty neat. And then I can put any of these back on top, including Titania maybe. Now I don't have the mana to cast Ashling's Command. So also don't necessarily want to discard it. We'll give a Cavalier haste just because we can. Alright, so I mean, this could have been worse. Next turn we do have to deal with Flage. And we are at 9, so don't have a ton of life to spare. But Titania getting back a land seems decent. And then the land is untapped. So I can still activate the Cavalier. And get a nice attack in myself. And yeah, next turn we could still copy a Cavalier with Ashling's command, perhaps. Flage take out Titania is probably the play for them. And they also had an Enduring Innocence. Scorcher's also interesting. So now what? If I play Ashling, I wouldn't be able to evoke the Scorcher right now. I could command copy Cavalier, draw 2 cards, perhaps. Or I could attack into Flage, but our opponent can escape it again. And finish it off with a 2 damage if they block my 5/3. Don't hate, copy Cavalier, draw 2. Alright, find a Shroud Stomper. So maybe I don't need Scampering Scorcher. I can play Fanatic, which then sets up a bunch of mana for next turn. And then we can maybe evoke the Shroud Stomper. So no attacks. Let's play it safe. And trading doesn't necessarily benefit me. Our opponent is gonna take out Fanatic. So now I won't be able to go Ashling Evoke. Flage attacks. Probably forced to trade here, otherwise we're dead next turn. And then is there a difference trading with a token against the red-white? It's not like they're gonna bounce it. I might be able to get the Cavalier back somehow. Opponent does take 2. Okay, so I have a 9 mana. I guess I can now evoke Shroud Stomper, which seems worthwhile. And pick up a Fury. Attack. Opponent jumps with Innocence. Flage will be back, taking out Ashling this time. So yeah, the game goes on. But Fury with haste from Cavalier's not bad either. So yeah, that land tax ended up being super valuable since it not only provided a lot of extra lanes, but also helped fill the graveyard to escape Flage several times. And Baird hits for 3, leaves behind a token. And a Wistfulness, okay. So, cast Fury for 5 mana. And then I could still give it haste. Take out Siege Veteran, Soldier token, attack. And then we pretty much force Flage to block. That's one approach. Fanatic with haste. almost pays for itself, so that's another play we could consider. Play Fanatic, give it a haste, taps for 4. Can still play Fury. So give haste. Play Fury. And then we have a mountain left to fetch. And attack. Opponent is forced to block. And now they won't be able to escape Flage as far as we know. Alright, let's see what happens. Wistfulness could take out Innocence next turn, can also give it haste. But yeah, if our opponent's got some huge hasty creature, we could be dead. Fetch land, I guess, puts an extra card in graveyard. Mesium Mortars, the Fanatic. So now Flage could be back once again. Yeah, I mean, the opponent's game has been all about Flage. Shield of Argive. We're down to 3. Innocence draws. And a Grief. Probably a little late to the party. So I can cast Wistfulness. See what we pick up. Take it from there. Couple of lanes, unfortunately. So I can still cast the Grief and then maybe give creatures haste with Command Tower. Alright, opponent's holding all lanes now. But yeah, Flage just kills us if they get a chance to attack with it, so all I can do is activate, attack, and hope for the best. But our opponent can just chump, take 4, fall to 3, and then Flage will do it on the way back. It's an incredibly close game here. GG's. But Flage gets it done. On to the next one. Alright, we're on the draw, facing Elspeth, Stormslayer, mono-white tokens. Not gonna be an easy matchup, although Thunderflock could be an effective way to bounce a whole bunch of tokens. Could also be a Heir Apparent deck, if they're running kind of the budget version. So we'll see. For now, looking at a turn 2 Flamebraider, Risen Reef. Do have some nice top ends at least. Yep, Heir Apparent it is. I guess it's gonna be a race to get to our Thunderflock pretty much. And with Ashling we could evoke it. Well, Path to Exile at least gives us a land in return. Okay, so Ashling versus Risen Reef. Ashling blocks a little bit better. And then next turn I could look into evoking some of our creatures already. That seems a little bit more powerful. Could play the fetch now to make Lumra better, or I can save myself some damage. And this is going to be double Heir Apparent. So if they can fly the team with Elspeth, we're in trouble. So I kind of have to consider Sunderflock already. I guess what I can do is evoke Lumra and then still evoke Sunderflock for 1 mana afterwards. Since, yeah, it does get a discount, so actually we should be in great shape. Evoke this for 4. Get a bunch of lands back. Lumra's back. Milling a few more lanes, perfect. And then I can evoke this for 0 mana, in fact. Send all those bunnies packing. And, oh, by the way, attack you for 17. Now I don't get to keep any of these in play, but we still have some nice leftovers and now plenty of mana to deploy those threats. Okay, so which sequencing makes sense? Can just cast Risen Reef normally, and then evoke Omnath. Then play my lanes. And we'll get to fetch as well. Making a bunch of elemental tokens in the process. Deal with Heir Parents. Make some more tokens. Yeah, Risen Reef plus Omnath is pretty brutal. And we're not done yet. I can still fetch. Twice, in fact. And then I'll still be able to evoke something. Urza's Incubator can discount elementals by 2. But I would not be able to cast anything at the moment outside of Masked Vandal or Ashling. So I think we just evoke Soul of Migration. Put as much stuff in play as possible. Make a bunch of birds. Take out Sanctifier with Omnath as well, since an elemental died. And attack. Okay, bonus at 4. And we've got a pretty impressive board state. Opponent fighting the good fight with Heir Parents. But we can turn the team sideways. Alright, there we have it. So yeah, Sunderflock is quite the card in this deck. Being able to cast it for 0 mana. On to the next one. Alright, we're on the draw, facing Rofellos. So this is going to be a pretty difficult matchup unless we have some cheap removal for Rofellos, which our deck doesn't really produce. That being said, maybe Pilgrim into Incubator, and then we can try to set something up. Give it a shot. Game will be over pretty quickly, one way or another. Now we could evoke Grief, but I think I need to keep the Viper. Start with Pilgrim. So next turn our opponent could have 6 mana already, which is pretty ridiculous. So I could either play Ashling with a plan of evoking, or if I play Incubator I can play 1 mana Ashling and then still evoke next turn. So the upside's a bit higher. Even though our opponent could also have some elementals. So I'm gonna have to wait on Grief. Mox Amber, okay, even more mana. So they can cast a 7-drop or even a 9 mana elemental. Primeval Titan, pretty good here on turn 3. And found a Yarok. That one's not bad either. So, play Ashling, and then we can evoke Rottenmouth, which will deal some damage, or we can evoke Grief, which is probably more important. Make sure our opponent doesn't have some finishers in hand that can take me out. So with a 2 mana discount, I can evoke Grief using Ashling. Could also go Yarok, evoked, and then pitch Rottenmouth to the Grief. So there's quite a few permutations here. Sacrificing Grief to play Vipers, also an option. So I'll cast this for 2 mana, so I don't have to pitch anything. See what they're working with. Alright, so bunch of decent cards. A loot might actually be the scarier mana sink compared to the Zone Guard. And then I can still cast Rottenmouth Viper for a 1 mana if I'm willing to sack a few things, or for 0 mana and then it will have haste. Although what I could also do is go Masked Vandal for 1 mana. Get rid of the Mox. Get rid of Grief. And then Rottenmouth for 0 mana, sacking Vandal and Grief. Rottenmouth triggers. Opponent probably loses 4 life. Rottenmouth comes back. Opponent loses another 4. And then we get to attack, and our opponent would lose 8. So this is a lot of damage. May as well send the 1/3. So yeah, opponent falls to 2. So now any hasty elemental could finish them off. And our opponent's top decking. Not too scared of a Zone Guard getting back a fetch land. Yeah, imagine if we also had a Yarok in play when playing the Viper. Could have been more patient, I suppose. But just evoking a Yarok and attacking would be lethal here. And yeah, our opponent scoops it up, so even without dealing with Rofellos, Ashling still goes over the top. Awesome, on to the next one. Okay, we're on the play, facing Hei Bai, Forest Guardian. I do not have green on turn 1 unless Cavern names Halfling. And then I still won't be able to play Fanatic on 2. So, yeah, this one's a little awkward without a green source. This one's better. Multiple ways to discount our elementals. Do we start with Mana Confluence? Could also just get like a Stomping Ground. And then we'll have potentially 3 colors for Vivid to draw off Shine Striker. For now I'm happy with Herald's Horn. Name Elemental. And then of course against the Shrine deck we're hoping to draw some of our disenchant effects that we can maybe trigger multiple times. Titania's not bad with a fetch land in the graveyard, so could go for that now. Or I can still try something like Gathering Stone, but I wouldn't be able to play anything alongside it. So I'm kind of liking Titania, get back fetch land, and then I can still cast a 1-drop afterwards. Alright, and our opponent scoops it up, I'll take it. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the play, facing the nerfed version of Vivi. Voice of Resurgence is going to be useful if they're running counter spells. Yeah, I think we've got a keeper. Solitude to answer Vivi. Start with probably Halfling. So I could already play turn to Ashling, or I can go Llanowar Elves, and then next turn go Voice plus Halfling, which might be better. And yeah, opponent does seem to be holding a free interactive spell of some sort. We'll grab Plains here. Yeah, we drew two of our cards that are great at punishing counter spells. This might be a subtlety. Of course, they're not going to want a Pact of Negation this early in the game, or they would lose to it. But now we can also make an uncounterable Ashling. So yeah, we'll see. Voice also a good one to evoke, since it will leave behind some large elemental tokens. And this can put counters on creatures, so you can see the synergy with Vivi. Okay, for now just play Ashling and attack, can fetch up a tap Triome. And then next turn evoke a Soul of Migration. Hope our opponent doesn't have any board wipes. Although if they play Vivi, we can also exile it. Opponent runs out Vivi. And they can immediately put a counter on it. I'm gonna wait to untap. So technically, if they have a Pact of Negation, they could try to stop the Solitude and then still pay for it. But then it would also trigger the Voice. So yeah, let's start with just a normally cast Solitude. So we get to keep it on the battlefield. Yep, and there's a Pact of Negation. So at least they're kind of locked into paying for it, and we got to make an elemental. And can maybe save the fetch land for some of our landfall synergies. Good attack with Ashling doesn't really make a difference. So Vivi is tapped for now. And Omnath was a pretty good draw. Currently have 3 elementals. So would not be able to finish off Vivi. But I can go face and then trigger landfall twice. So that's an option. Or I can just evoke Soul of Migration first, which I also don't hate. Applies a good bit of pressure. And this will also grow our elemental token quite a bit. Opponent's at 4. But now is a scary turn where they get to untap with Vivi. And have access to a ton of mana. Can they overcome this? We can cast an uncounterable Omnath with Halfling next turn and just go upstairs. That's my plan. Can our opponent maybe string together a bunch of extra turns or bounce our entire board? Fabricate to find an artifact. Maybe a Mox. Or maybe a Paradox Engine to go infinite with Vivi. Because yeah, I guess now Vivi is pretty busted with Paradox Engine, which is still legal in Brawl. Opponent gets Marvin, which has Vivi's activated ability. Of course, still has Summoning Sickness. Courier, that's fine. Alright, is that it? Alright, and our opponent explodes. Don't even need to show them Omnath, can just attack for the win. Sweet, on to the next one. Okay, we're on the draw, facing Maralen, so elves and fairies. Our hand is a little clunky, missing the early mana accelerants. Although Fury evoked pitching Ashling's command could do some serious damage if our opponent's playing a bunch of mana elves. So yeah, maybe this could still work if we just get to 4 mana and start evoking these. no 1-mana elf from our opponents, but a Priest of Titania, which is their best 2-drop. Cannot even cast a halfling unless we use Cavern of Souls on halfling, but I'm probably gonna need it on elemental. Yeah, I guess I'll still go for halfling and then wait another turn on Fury. Not too many citizens either in our deck. Archdruid, perfect, so now Fury can clean up both elves. And I can play Ashling alongside it. And then pitch probably Ashling's command, since these I can at least evoke with my commander. Even though dealing 2 damage to each creature later could also be useful. So 2 damage to Archdruid, 1 to Priest would be enough technically. But yeah, opponent scoops it up, so I'll take it. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the draw, facing Kellan, Daring Traveler. We've got a keeper. Swords into Ashling, into another Ashling. Don't know if I can fetch planes or if I need to get a Shockland. Opponent does make a map first. And Experiment 1, another creature that can slowly grow over time. So, opponent does not attack with Pelt Collector, maybe afraid of some interaction or a flash creature here, or they just forgot. Start by getting a Catria Triome. And then I'll want to play Ashling. Discard. Maybe it is Grief. Could still, of course, evoke it for 4 mana after we play the other Ashling. Could also maybe get rid of Masked Vandal, since there's no artifact or enchantment in play that I'm too scared of. Ideally pair Omnath with a fetch land. Probably a reason to maybe get a white source in play for swords. But next turn I will be tapping out for Ashling. Found our white mana. So cannot afford to transform this turn unless we wanna just cast a Grief. Cannot quite cast a nerfed version of Omnath. I think we wait. And for now just play Ashling. And then next turn I could transform and then evoke. Because if we can evoke Omnath and then go fetch, get another land, we'll get 4 mana in return. So we can evoke Grief afterwards as well, which would be a pretty exciting turn. Let's see what Kellan has to offer. Surveil land to set up the top before they attack. Says no to Eiganjo. And finds the Ozolith. And keeps that one on top. Alright, take 3. Pilgrim's fine. Possible they have a counterspell in hand. But let's try transforming. And then step 1, evoke Omnath. That works. So we'll get to draw 2 cards. Now we can play our fetch lanes. And then Rottenmouth Viper is kind of tempting too here, if I can cast it. So we'll get 4 mana. I think I still start with Grief, although Cavalier is also an option. And then just discard a bunch of lanes. But if I evoke Grief, we get the double discard. And then I can still play Viper afterwards. Grab a Solitude. Grief comes back. And then evoke Viper. sacking 1, 2, 3 creatures. And since I'm sacrificing them, they also come back with Ashling. At least the non-tokens. Interesting that this one comes back in the transformed form. Would not have necessarily guessed that. So yeah, going for a pretty aggressive line here with the Viper. Possible I could have just played the swords this turn and then wait another turn to set this all up. But we were able to make use of creatures that were going to get sacrificed anyways. So Viper's back, attack. And then next turn Cavalier's looking good. Opponent falls to 11. They will pick up an Ossolith. So we should have a good block on a 2-2. And an invasion is not good enough. Okay. And another Cavalier is also great. But yeah, let's just go for the red one first. Keep up white mana. I'll tap manually. And then once again, discard Farseek and Nissa. Okay, go ahead and attack. And if I attack with both, opponent has to trump. And then I can still maybe Swords Kellan. Alright, pass it back. Okay, maybe wait on an Ossolith trigger to swords. But yeah, now we know we have lethal with the Flying Cavalier. So I don't even have to swords if I don't want to. But I guess our opponent gaining 3 is still fine. Alright, so yeah, good to see pretty cool interaction with a Rottenmouth and Ashling as another way to sacrifice your elementals. And then Cavalier dying, of course, is also a way to get rid of the cards you put back on top, which is pretty nifty. So the Brainstorm is actually useful, and then we also have a fetch lane for the second Brainstorm effect. So we can put some lands on top that we get to maybe shuffle away. Scry those to the bottom. And just attack. Alright, and there we have it. So yeah, we get to see this 5-color Evoke Elemental deck in action, and it's a lot of fun, although the matchmaker does pair us against some of the heavy hitters in the Brawl queue, so you're not going to get many easy matchups, although it's understandable why the matchmaker would pair us against some pretty strong decks, since at the end of the day we have some of those constructed staples like Fury and Solitude, which also see play in some of the top decks, so that might also be skewing some of the matchmaking algorithm behind the scenes. But of course we don't know for a fact how it works, so it's just kind of a guess. But yeah, for now I want to thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed, and as always, have a nice day.